Actually, what Mark Carney said last week was true. He said we face the lowest effective tariff of any country. So if we can just keep it that way until we renegotiate CUSMA, I think we'll be in good shape. The key thing, and this is critical for Quebec, is to get those aluminum tariffs reduced or eliminated entirely.
When Trump's tariffs struck Canadian steel and aluminum, the shock reverberated through North America's industrial core. These metals are not marginal products. They are the foundation of Canada's modern economy, supporting auto plants in Ontario, aerospace manufacturers in Quebec, and construction projects nationwide. According to statistics, Canada exports of steel and aluminum together are valued in the tens of billions annually, directly tied to hundreds of thousands of jobs. In August, Ottawa confirmed that U.S. duties on these products remained at some of the highest levels, ranging from 35% to 50%. For Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, and Saguenay, those numbers represent far more than trade policy. They represent the survival of local economies built around mills and smelters that have anchored communities for generations.
In response, Carney's government avoided escalating across the board. Retaliatory tariffs on most U.S. goods were lifted to keep the dialogue open, but countermeasures on steel and aluminum stayed firmly in place. Alongside that, Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced a $1 billion support package in July designed to sustain operations, safeguard jobs, and help companies weather the uncertainty. This mix of selective defense and domestic reinforcement sent two messages. To Washington, it showed that Canada would not yield on core industries. To Canadian workers, it demonstrated that the government was prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. The move also helped reassure provincial leaders in Ontario and Quebec that Ottawa was not abandoning industrial communities at the front line of the tariff battle. By investing heavily in workers, Canada demonstrated that its strategy is not just reactive, it is proactive, setting the stage for resilience in future disputes as well.
So I think there is reason to be optimistic. Canada accounts for about 70% of U.S. aluminum imports. The United States doesn't make a lot of aluminum. And so I think we could probably get those tariffs reduced.
What makes Canada's position stronger than it may appear is the underlying structure of the market. U.S. trade data shows that roughly 70% of aluminum imported into America comes from Canada, while Canadian steel remains deeply embedded in auto supply chains across the Great Lakes. These are not easy flows to replace. U.S. smelters have struggled for years due to high electricity costs, while Quebec enjoys abundant hydroelectricity that allows its aluminum industry to remain globally competitive. In steel, Canadian inputs are vital to automakers in Detroit and suppliers in Ohio. Tariffs may create headlines, but they also raise costs for American producers and consumers. In practice, the U.S. needs Canadian metals just as much as Canada needs access to the U.S. market. That mutual dependence gives Ottawa leverage every time Trump threatens new measures. It is a reminder that geography and integration, not political slogans, define the real balance of power in North America's industrial system. The clash over steel and aluminum illustrates how Canada is adapting to an era of constant tariff threats. Trump has made himself the central figure in this drama, but Canada has refused to play the role of a passive target. By holding firm on core industries, delivering direct support to workers, and keeping channels of negotiation open, Ottawa has created a balanced strategy that combines toughness with pragmatism. As the 2026 USMCA review approaches, the resilience of steel and aluminum will be a benchmark for how well Canada has managed its relationship with Washington. Trump may rely on tariffs to project power, but Canada has shown that endurance, resource advantages, and careful strategy can be just as powerful. This is not a story of capitulation. It is the story of a country proving that it can defend its backbone industries and remain an indispensable partner in North America's economic future.
There's likely to be a fourfold increase in the demand for critical metals and minerals over the course of the next decade. So we're creating a rare earth magnet supply chain between Quebec, between Canada and Germany.
There is no doubt anymore. Trump's tariffs have pushed America's closest neighbor, Canada, to turn toward Europe. When Donald Trump slapped a 35% tariff on Canadian exports outside CUSMA this August, the expectation was clear. Canada would bend. Instead, Mark Carney flipped the script. He scaled back some counter-tariffs while keeping steel, aluminum, and autos protected, signaling that Canada would not give away its leverage. That shift opened the door to something larger. Rather than fight Washington blow for blow, Ottawa turned to Europe, using its vast reserves of copper, lithium, and rare earth minerals to build new alliances. What began as a tariff assault quickly evolved into a story of how Canada could outplay Trump by turning resources into power.
Now, Germany has been amongst the leaders in beginning that diversification away from China, particularly China and Russia. Canada can play a role in accelerating that diversification for Germany and for Europe.
That strategy came into focus during Carney's European tour this August. His stops included Berlin, Warsaw, and Riga. But the most important outcome came in Germany. Canada and Germany issued a joint declaration to deepen cooperation on critical minerals, the raw materials that power everything from electric vehicles to wind turbines. Under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, Canada already had preferential access to the European Union market. Carney used that framework to accelerate new projects in copper, lithium, and rare earths. For Germany, the timing was critical. Since cutting energy ties with Russia, Berlin has been searching for secure supply chains. For Canada, the partnership provided not only an economic outlet, but also a political counterbalance to Trump's tariffs. Instead of depending solely on the U.S. market, Canada was locking in opportunities across the Atlantic with Europe's largest economy as a new anchor.
What turned headlines into substance were the deals signed on the ground. In Berlin, Carney announced that Troy Gold, a Canadian mining company, secured a long-term copper supply contract with Arabis AG, a German smelting and recycling group. In Quebec, Tornat Metals entered into an agreement with VAC, one of the global leaders in rare earth magnets. This created a direct Canada-Germany supply chain for magnets essential to clean energy and defense industries. At the same time, Rocktech Lithium, a Canadian-German company, advanced a new lithium arrangement to support Europe's decarbonization plans. These transactions showed that Canada was not just making declarations, but building the physical trade flows that could sustain a rare earth alliance. Industry experts note that global demand for critical minerals is expected to quadruple by 2035, according to the International Energy Agency. By acting early, Canada positioned itself as a secure supplier for Europe at a moment when the United States was driving uncertainty with new tariffs. What Trump used as a blunt instrument, Ottawa turned into leverage.
Donald Trump helped us get here.
A lesson that our partners to the south, the Americans, have learned about the vulnerabilities in the rare earth magnet supply chain.
And so we need to move quickly.
The contrast could not be clearer. Trump relies on tariffs that disrupt trade and rattle markets. Canada focuses on partnerships that bring stability and predictability. By leaning into critical minerals and strengthening ties with Germany and the wider EU, Carney showed that Canada is not simply reacting to Washington's pressure, it is setting its own course. This strategy also gives Canada more influence in its dealings with the United States. Trump may dominate headlines with new tariff threats, but Canada controls assets that Washington and its allies cannot ignore. Copper, lithium, and rare earth magnets are at the heart of the next-generation economy, and Canada is turning them into instruments of national strength. In this round of trade confrontation, Ottawa did more than withstand pressure. It shifted the board entirely. The message is clear. Trump can raise tariffs, but Canada now holds something more valuable: the trust of partners and the resources to power the future.
Well, let's talk about this extended truce between China and the U.S. that was announced by President Trump.
I think that President Trump didn't have much of a choice because China is in a very strong position to negotiate.
If China is operating from a power position, what about Canada?
In early August, two very different trade stories unfolded. In Washington, President Donald Trump announced a 90-day extension of the U.S.-China tariff truce. The White House framed it as a way to buy time and secure new commitments on U.S. chip exports and energy sales to China. Beijing, for its part, still controls most of the world's rare earth production and had just opened new zero-tariff access to dozens of African nations, strengthening its own negotiating position. But while Trump eased tensions with Beijing, the pressure on Canada stayed intact. Since August 1st, Canadian goods that don't qualify under USMCA rules have faced a 35% U.S. tariff, a rate raised from 25% in late July. There's no sign yet of a reduction, and Ottawa has received none of the temporary tariff delays that Mexico secured. The contrast is clear. One neighbor gets more time, the other gets more heat. For Trump, tariffs are more than an economic measure. They're a negotiating lever. The official justifications change frequently. Border security, fentanyl, dairy, even unrelated sectors like banking. With China, the 90-day truce was tied to specific exchanges. More U.S. chips from companies like NVIDIA, more American ethane for Chinese industry, and the understanding that Beijing's dominance in critical minerals gives it leverage. With Canada, the calculus is different. Keeping tariffs high maintains pressure ahead of a possible early USMCA reopening. It limits Ottawa's breathing space and forces Canadian negotiators to consider concessions to avoid further escalation. Trump's track record with other partners, from the EU's capped 15% rates to Switzerland's 39%, shows how he uses these numbers to anchor hard bargaining.
We are in a difficult position with the U.S. We're subject now to a tariff of 35%. We have to put in place a very elaborate plan to diversify our exports.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has avoided rushing into retaliatory moves, opting for a mix of steady dialogue and visible domestic reinforcement. In July, Ottawa announced over $1 billion Canadian dollars in measures to protect the steel sector, including procurement rules favoring Canadian steel and aluminum, funding to reskill affected workers, and infrastructure investments to stabilize supply. These supports aim to absorb some of the market shock from the U.S. tariffs, which since June 4th have been as high as 50% on U.S. imports of Canadian steel and aluminum. According to the Canadian Steel Producers Association, about 6 to 6.5 million tons of steel lost access to the U.S. market after those measures. The domestic plan opens a 2 to 2.5 million ton opportunity for Canadian producers, a first step in restructuring away from over-reliance on U.S. buyers.
Europe is an obvious partner. It has a very mature economy. They're interested in all kinds of goods that we can export.
But we will also work with new partners or partners that we have not developed commercial relationship as deep as the U.S. one, including, of course, with Europe and key Asian countries.
At the same time, Canada is deepening ties with the European Union. Under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, most goods already trade tariff-free, but new talks are focusing on aligning industrial strategy in sectors like steel, aluminum, and critical minerals. With a market of roughly 450 million people and stable regulatory rules, the EU offers a reliable alternative that reduces Canada's exposure to U.S. tariff swings. Trump's strategy is built on speed. Apply tariffs, create immediate discomfort, and extract concessions quickly. Carney's counter is built on endurance. Reinforce domestic industries, diversify export markets, and keep diplomatic channels open until the balance shifts. While over 85% of Canada's exports to the U.S. still move tariff-free under USMCA rules, Ottawa holds cards that are hard for Washington to replace: strategic minerals, integrated auto supply chains, and substantial oil and gas flows. By protecting these advantages and expanding reliable partnerships like the EU, Canada aims to make sure it can withstand U.S. tariff pressure longer than Trump expects. The fight isn't just over rates and exemptions. It's about shaping the trade rules that will define North America for the next decade. And on that front, Canada is determined not to play from behind.
About 55% of Indian exports to the U.S. are expected to take a hit from tariffs imposed by the Trump administration.
As expected, the White House has announced an increase on duties to Canadian softwood lumber.
But a lot of companies have signaled that price hikes aren't. How might this all look in a real person's life?
From the diamond on a finger to the wooden frame of a home, American consumers are paying the price for President Donald Trump's tariff politics. Since August 1st, his administration has pushed ahead with aggressive new trade measures, and they're hitting both luxury goods and everyday essentials. Two flashpoints stand out: a 50% tariff on Indian goods, including most of the diamonds entering the U.S., and a series of steep duties on Canadian exports, including softwood lumber, now taxed at over 35%. The White House frames these moves as leverage, a way to draw better deals for America. But the cost is landing in the laps of U.S. households, from engagement rings to new housing construction.
Right now, 90% of diamonds are manufactured in India, so cut and polished in India. That's not going to change in the near term. So a lot of this price increase will get passed on to the U.S. consumer.
India is the beating heart of the global diamond trade. Around 90% of the world's diamonds are cut and polished there, according to the Gem and Jewelry Export Promotion Council. In early August, the U.S. raised tariffs on Indian goods from 25% to 50%, citing India's continued purchases of Russian oil. In New York's Diamond District, the impact was immediate. Jewelers can't absorb that kind of cost. When the duty was at 10%, the industry could share the hit between suppliers and customers. At 50%, the math no longer works. Retail prices are expected to rise sharply heading into the holiday season, a time when jewelry sales normally peak. This comes on top of another factor. Gold prices are already at record highs, roughly double what they were just a few years ago. Together, these forces are pushing engagement rings and other fine jewelry further out of reach for many Americans. Some buyers are even considering traveling overseas to make purchases where tariffs don't apply. But that option is hardly realistic for most. The result is a squeeze on an industry that was already undergoing change, as lab-grown diamonds take a larger share of the market. The same kind of cost pressure is now emerging in America's trade with Canada. The clearest example is in softwood lumber. This month, Washington doubled certain duties, bringing the total rate on Canadian softwood to 35.19%.
Tariffs have added $6,000 to the cost of building a single-family home in the United States.
This is also going to make it next to impossible for Americans, middle-class Americans, to build their home.
That's not just a number on paper. The Ontario Forest Industries Association cites research showing it adds about $6,000 to the cost of building a single-family home in the United States. Canadian officials point out that these costs will fall hardest on middle-class families and on Americans rebuilding after disasters like wildfires and hurricanes. Ottawa isn't sitting idle, though. Just days before the U.S. announcement, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government unveiled a $1.2 billion Canadian support package for the industry, including $700 million Canadian in loan guarantees to keep mills running and $500 million Canadian to diversify markets and develop new products. From diamonds to lumber, Trump's tariffs are reshaping the American marketplace, making luxury items harder to afford and driving up the cost of everyday necessities. The Yale Budget Lab projects the 2025 tariff package could add thousands of dollars to the average household's annual expenses, tightening budgets nationwide. While Trump wields tariffs as a negotiation tool, Canada under Prime Minister Mark Carney is taking a steadier path, reinforcing its industries, keeping retaliation measured, and diversifying toward markets in Europe and Asia. The real test is whether these tariff politics will deliver lasting gains for the U.S. or simply leave Americans paying more while Canada holds its ground.
Certainly sounds like Canada-U.S. trade talks are in a holding pattern. That is after President Donald Trump raised tariffs on certain Canadian goods. Some of the country's premiers are calling for retaliation.
Taking the American alcohol off the shelves, looking at the procurement process, we have to, push back for sure.
At midnight on August 1st, President Trump raised tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by USMCA from 25% to 35%. It was a dramatic move aimed at punishing Canada for refusing to sign a last-minute trade deal. Unlike South Korea or the EU, Canada stood its ground, insisting on a fair agreement instead of rushing under pressure. The tariff hit a small share of total exports but carried symbolic weight, signaling that even a close ally could be targeted. It marked a shift from cooperation to confrontation, straining a trade relationship long seen as one of the most stable in the world.
Canada's strong. We can give ourselves far more than anyone can take away. Building sustainably, building together, building positively, and that's what we're going to do. And yes, we'll come to something with the Americans.
But Canada didn't respond with noise. There were no podium outbursts, no rushed retaliatory tariffs. What followed was calm, measured, and quietly firm. Ordinary Canadians voiced frustration but not fear. They've seen this before. During Trump's first term, retaliatory bans on U.S. products, like removing American whiskey from shelves, caused real political ripples south of the border. That memory remains. Today, many Canadians favor long-term resilience over tit-for-tat escalation. The broader public mood in Canada has shifted. People are exhausted by cycles of unpredictability and power plays. Trump's approach is seen not as diplomacy but as theater. And Canada this time is choosing not to be part of the show. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not sign a last-minute deal like South Korea or the European Union. He made clear that Canada wouldn't accept a template agreement that didn't serve national interests. In public remarks, Carney emphasized sustainability and national self-confidence. He acknowledged the complexity of negotiations, but did not waver. His strategy is deliberate: avoid a bad deal, wait out the noise, and protect long-term national leverage. Trump expected submission. What he got was defiance, delivered without spectacle.
And when you blow up a relationship as important to that process as the U.S.-Canada relationship, there are consequences.
In fact, a few days ago, it was reported that Canada and Mexico are working on a, quote, Northern Corridor agreement and to create easier trade between Mexico and Canada without involving the United States.
Economists quickly noted most of Canada's exports to the U.S., about 95%, remain protected under the USMCA. Only a small share is affected by the new tariff. But that small share carries symbolic weight, especially in provinces like Ontario, where politically sensitive sectors like steel and automotive are centered. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, publicly warned that these moves are eroding trust. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship stood out globally for its stability. Defense, intelligence, and cultural ties went hand in hand with trade. But that trust, painstakingly rebuilt during the Biden administration, has now taken another hit. And behind the scenes, Canada and Mexico are accelerating plans for a $120 billion Northern Corridor trade route, bypassing the U.S. entirely. It's a quiet signal that some allies are preparing for a future with less American reliability. Trump's team pointed to a 3% GDP increase in Q2 as proof of strength. But economists, including those cited by Commerce Department briefings, explained the rise was mostly a technical bounce, driven by a sharp drop in imports after businesses rushed to stockpile ahead of tariff deadlines. In April, Trump had claimed to have made 200 trade deals. By August 1st, the actual number was closer to 8. Canada, notably, wasn't one of them. Trump's strategy is to appear strong, but with every tariff that alienates a key partner, the U.S. risks standing more alone, isolated from the very allies it once relied on. Canada isn't just holding firm. It's quietly walking away from the pressure and keeping its options open.